Castro always knew what he was aiming to accomplish in Cuba. He wanted to change it into a fair country that had a real impact on the world. The Cuban Revolution achieved this goal. The revolutionary completely transformed Cuba, altering its foreign relations, economy, and government, seemingly for the better. But the important issue and defining factor about the Cuban Revolution is how these changes had a major impact on the world by escalating the Cold War.
In the mid-1900s, Cuba was controlled by President Fulgencio Batista. Batista took control of the country in 1952 using a military coup. This destroyed any chance the Cuban people had of having a democratic country. Before the Cuban Revolution, the U.S. was Cuba's major ally supporting the oppressive regime created by Batista. The friendly U.S. relations brought a lot of wealth to Cuba. Cuba gained large amounts of tourism from U.S. citizens, and the U.S. became the main source of trade for Cuba. The U.S. also had its own businesses and farms in Cuba. The U.S. financial interests included 90% of Cuban mines, 80% of its public utilities, 50% of its railways, 40% of its sugar production, and 25% of its bank deposits, some $1 billion in total.
The U.S.'s investment in Cuba was disliked by the Cuban people. The tourists that the U.S. brought gave Cuba a reputation for being a haven of prostitution, brothels, and gambling. At one point early in the revolution, the Cuban people had had enough of the corruption and negative reputation of their country. So, a group of students stormed the royal palace in protest. This was a critical moment in the revolution. Castro, recognized as one of the leaders of the revolution, was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He delivered his own offense, saying, "History will absolve me." He was later released because of political pressure on Batista, and as a result became the leader of the revolutionary movement.
Castro wasn't content with just liberating his own people. He wanted a global stage, so he began to encourage the people of other countries to revolt. He and a fellow revolutionary, Che Guevara, were trying to help other countries break away from their U.S. invader, and with this, it became apparent that the Cuban Revolution was not just about Cuba. Instead, it was about power for Castro. He even said outright that any revolutionary movement in any corner of the world can count on the help of Cuban fighters. The revolution gave Castro power to take a global stand against democracy and capitalism, but, more importantly, it gave him the power to take a global stand against the United States. The Cold War was no longer just about the U.S. and Russia. Because of Castro and the Cuban Revolution, it was now a global war.
Because of the Cuban Revolution and Castro's leadership, communism began to spread to other countries. The U.S. wanted to prevent that so that the communist nations and Soviet allies wouldn't become too powerful. This mindset carried on through several presidencies and for years to come. In fact, President Ronald Reagan came into office determined to fight the spread of communism. The Cuban Revolution and Castro had polarized the world, with one side being for U.S. democracy and capitalism, and the other USSR and communism. Also, since more countries became involved in the Cold War, there became a real threat of fighting and a fear of nuclear war. The Cold War was now hot.
Castro knowingly put the people of Cuba into an intense and dangerous situation. The very people he had resolved to save were now at risk of annihilation, and he was willing to make them yet another sacrifice. Castro later said, "I would have agreed to the use of nuclear weapons. We took it for granted that it would have become a nuclear war anyway, and that we were going to disappear." Since Cuba was so geographically close to the U.S., they became a critical threat to the U.S. and ultimately caused the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union capitalized on Castro's eagerness to take revenge upon the U.S. and his hunger for power by placing a nuclear arsenal there, only 90 miles from the U.S. border. They then began threatening to blow up the U.S. Neither the U.S. or the USSR truly wanted to use their missiles because the loss of life would have been catastrophic. However, between the eagerness of Castro and the power play of both countries, they were on the verge of having to use them. This time marks the apex of the Cold War, a point that would never have happened if not for Castro and the Cuban Revolution.
Although many facts point to the Cuban Revolution being a negative turning point on a global level, many people romanticize it as just a revolution of the poor overcoming their oppressors. When you see discussions of the Cuban Revolution by students wearing their Che Guevara t-shirts, it is generally seen as just the people of Cuba trying to take back their country from the U.S. influence and an oppressive dictator. We see lots of great evidence of accomplishments from the revolution, like 15,000 new classrooms being created. Many believe we shouldn't see the Cuban Revolution as a negative, as a power grab by Castro who used it to escalate the Cold War in hopes of taking down the United States, because the revolution initially did accomplish many great things for the Cuban people. They argue that by trying to help other revolutions, Castro was just trying to help other countries defeat oppression. He was not trying to spread communist views. Many believe the Cuban Revolution was about Cuba and nothing else, and it is celebrated as a success.
The idea of the Cuban Revolution as a romanticized revolution is just that, a romanticization. The Cuban people revolting were just looking out for Cuba. Their intentions were simply to liberate their country. But in reality, Castro and the new government reverted back to the ways of Batista. Soon after the start of the Cuban Revolution, Castro turned on his old plan of democracy and peace. Once he achieved that, the country again became a global issue because Cuba embodied a threat once again. The Cuban Revolution may have started out as an idea of nationalistic pride, but because of Castro and the other leaders of the revolution, it became about gaining global dominance.
The Cuban Revolution had a major impact on the Cold War by raising the stakes for the countries involved. The Cuban Revolution gave Cuba more power than they had ever had. Cuba now had a say in foreign affairs and had influence on other countries. When a new power, such as this one, arises and takes a side on an ongoing war, the new power can have a major impact. Cuba, having such an invaluable geographic location in a war between two countries spread very far apart, along with a leader willing to sacrifice his people, had a huge impact and raised the stakes of the war. Now it was a war with the potential for use of nuclear bombs and other controversial and experimental weapons. It escalated tensions and caused the week that changed the world, and ultimately brought a nuclear arms race that could have had a major impact and changed the physical and political structure of the world that we know.